figured it out. I figured it out from black and white.
Good evening. Glad to see you all here. This is the first Orthodoxy on Tap of our season. Today we have Eileen Dacey. She's a clinical hoarding specialist and program manager for hoarding and cluttering at the North Shore Elder Services in Danvers, Massachusetts. After completing her Bachelor of Science degree in psychology at the University of North Florida, Eileen moved to Massachusetts where she began working for an intelligence systems company that contracts with, among others, the Department of Defense, NASA, and the Department of Homeland Security. Finding this role personally unfulfilling and wanting to pursue a different track in human services, Eileen made a drastic career change. She returned to school to study social work, and she actually just completed her MSW at Simmons College, where she specialized in mental health and substance addiction. While at Simmons, Eileen's first internship was in the Hoarding and Cluttering program at North Shore Elder Services, which she pursued after attending her first annual conference on hoarding. Since then, Eileen has made it her life's work to educate others about hoarding. This includes local fire departments, police departments, and housing agencies, and people like you, anyone who's just interested in hearing about it. So without further ado, I ask you all to please extend a warm welcome to my better half, Eileen Dacey.
So as Tim mentioned, I am the program manager and clinical hoarding specialist at North Shore Elder Services. And today I'm not going to be going into too much depth about treatment for hoarding disorder. It's really just an overview and why we as Orthodox Christians should care about this. But first, I'd like to start with a little icebreaker exercise. Okay, so everyone have something in front of them? Now, what I'd like you to do is pass that item to the person sitting next to you. So now, what I'm going to have you do, and now I'm going to count until 3, but I want you to wait for my count, please. On the count of 3, I'm going to have you go through this wallet or purse that's in front of you. According to you, if you feel it does not belong, or you don't like it, it's ugly, it's useless, it doesn't fit, yes, on my count. And then at the end, I'm going to collect them, we're going to throw it away. Okay? We're going to throw it away. Okay? And no cheating. So ready? 1, 2, stop. Just kidding. I want you to go ahead and return it back to yeah. That's why I'm like, come on, you guys, it's all right, it's okay. So normally when I do this, I receive a lot of an anxious response. People are like, oh my God, you're gonna tell me that someone else is going to go through my wallet and throw things away? So I wanna ask everyone, what was the purpose of that exercise? Why did I ask you to do that?
To see the reaction of the person.
To see the reaction of the person. So now I'm going to ask you, what did it feel like when I first asked you to place your own belongings in front of you? Any thoughts come to mind? Like relief? Maybe curiosity, what's next? Confident? What about when the person sitting next to you, I was asking them to go through your belongings and then make decisions about them? I typically hear a lot of anxiety, invasive, right? This is an invasion of my personal space. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment someone coming into your home and then making judgments about your home. They don't like it, doesn't make sense, it's ugly, it's cluttered. Imagine what that might feel like, okay? Even worse, starting to move your things without your permission, even throwing things away without your permission. What might that feel like? If you're anything like me, when I'm preparing for any guests to come to my home, I need everything to be pristine. Everything needs to be perfect, right? Because I don't want to receive any sort of judgment myself. So the purpose of this exercise is really to kind of give you a sense of what this might feel like in terms of anxiety-provoking or feeling that invasion of personal space, your safe space, your sanctuary. And I deal with this on a daily basis. My clients will have people, whether they're landlords, housing authority directors, inspectors, Board of Health, come in and make judgments. This doesn't work, throw it all away. even worse, come in and do a full clean out without their permission. And imagine what might be in there, right? Memories, things that had happened in their childhood, right? Or maybe their children, because memories they had, maybe they lost the child. You never know. So there's a lot of other stories that are behind this. Now you have a bit of what we'll be talking about today. So we did the exercise. We'll talk about stigmas associated with hoarding, the prevalency. I'll briefly define what hoarding disorder is, and then we'll conclude with a discussion of why we should care as Orthodox Christians. So first, I want to open up with stigmas about hoarding. What sort of stigmas, misunderstandings, misinformation have you heard? Now, this can be based off the TV show. We talked about that. It can be based off of personal experience, personal encounters, things you've read online or in magazines. Mental health issues. Somebody's dirty. Insecurity. Yeah. Shopaholics. Yeah. So there's several terms that might come to mind. I might hear laziness. Why can't they just clean it up? Why can't they just throw it out? It's all junk. It's all trash. What's wrong with them? Depression. Yes, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Greed, because we do live in such a consumeristic society, right? Next, I do want to talk about the epidemiology of hoarding disorder. So there is a genetic component to hoarding. Does that surprise anyone? So research suggests that individuals who have a first-degree relative, a parent or something of that nature, with a hoarding issue, that there's a strong likelihood that their offspring might develop it as well. Okay, so actually more than 3/4 of people with hoarding disorder report that they did have a first-degree relative who also had hoarding problems. Is it nature versus nurture, right? Is this learned behavior? And I, quite honestly, I see a mix of both in my practice. Additionally, we'll see some processing and categorization deficits, actually, in individuals with hoarding disorder. How do I categorize? So people will typically create multiple categories and subcategories while they're going through their belongings, because everything is of mixed importance. So for example, if you were to start categorizing books in your study, for example, where would you begin? What are some ways that you might start to categorize and organize your books? Subject, most valuable books, that can be very subjective. Anything else? Color, alphabetically. Size. So I typically hear author, subject, size, color, and publication date. Those are the 5 main ones that I always hear when I'm doing trainings. So for example, if someone with hoarding disorder would begin to start categorizing their books, they might start by, okay, I have one book and it's by this one particular author. It's going to go in pile 1. Another book, same author but different subjects. I'm really unsure, pile 2. All right? Another book, same author, same subject, different publication date, pile 3. Now another book, same author, same subject, same publication date, different size, pile 4. And you see where I'm going. Same author, same publication date, same subject, same size, different color, pile 5. Perhaps to you and I, it would have just ended with same author, right? That would have been one pile, and I'm going to organize it that way and then go on my bookshelf, right? But someone with hoarding disorder has such processing and categorization deficits that even such a simple task can become very overwhelming, challenging, and that's just books of the same author. Now imagine other items within the home. Also, we'll see some biopsychosocial issues as well. So someone with hoarding disorder can also typically might have some medical or physical illness, a mental illness in addition to hoarding, right? There might be social effects, so impairments in social and occupational functioning. Now, in terms of social functioning, there you might see an increase in isolation. Why might that be? Shame and embarrassment is typically what I hear from my clients. I don't want to have someone come over because of that fear of being judged, right? And I can't quite get close to anyone because what do relationships entail? They entail eventually inviting someone over, right? So I might have the hope of wanting to have someone come over for tea, but then there's nowhere to sit. How do I invite them in? Maybe I can't even make the tea because the stove is covered, right? Maybe I can't even find my teapot, okay? Or even worse, what if I invite someone over and then they might report me, right? So then there's a lot of fears. And what comes with social isolation? Feeling very stressed, feeling very anxious, but if you tend to socially isolate, eventually you'll start to become very depressed, right? So there are 4 common comorbid disorders associated with hoarding. That means just co-occurring mental illnesses. Depression, anxiety, ADHD, that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and OCD. So hoarding disorder is actually a relatively new mental health diagnosis, although it's been studied for years and years and years. So originally, it was part of obsessive compulsive disorder that individuals with OCD would sometimes experience hoarding. And then it wasn't until the newest DSM, that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, came out, that it became classified as its own mental health diagnosis within the OCD-related spectrum. So there's a lot of similarities between OCD and hoarding. Also, I wanted to talk about deprivation. I heard this earlier from Pam. So then perhaps if you grew up or your parents grew up in a household, maybe they were of the World War II generation, where they didn't have too much, right? And is there a link? Is there a correlation between deprivation and hoarding? And so right now, researchers have been studying this, and there's no clear link. However, they suggest that there is the possibility of that correlation, but it's just not truly defined at this point. Okay, I see a mix. People who did grow up in deprived conditions, they have developed hoarding, and then I see people in affluent societies and households, and they also struggle with hoarding as well, and that might be part of that consumeristic shopaholic sort of thing going on. So also, hoarding behaviors are triggered by trauma or loss. So it's important to know that hoarding, it's not about the stuff. Go figure. Right? It's about the stories behind it too. So trauma, loss, even perceived loss. It's the loss of a job, right? I'm going to hold on to all of my work outfits, all of my suits, because that was my identity. And if I get rid of it, you're telling me to get rid of my identity, the only thing I ever knew? Maybe it belonged to my mother, right? And the loss of my mother was so hard for me that I want to hold on to everything that belonged to her. Again, I've already mentioned this and made this very clear that hoarding is a mental health disorder, but it's important to note that it is a chronic and progressive disorder, okay? So it's not just going to go away like that with treatment, right? So treatment would focus on behavior modification and skills development, so it can get to the point where then the individual would be able to maintain on their own. Okay, but we also see a lot of relapse. So it's very similar to substance abuse, although it's not considered an addiction, but you can go through the cycles, right, where things are maintained, things are going well, individuals are in action, right, and then something happens, right, another loss, another trauma being triggered in some way, shape, or form, and then you see another relapse. Also, some very interesting thoughts that I wanted to share. People with hoarding disorder also struggle with extreme perfectionism, procrastination, and indecisiveness. They tend to have higher IQ levels, higher education levels, and more creative than the average person. Does that surprise anyone? Yes. So even when I heard that for the first time, it surprised me. And that can also be that they see and they're more creative in some of the things that they're holding on to, right? Well, I could use these bottle caps to build a dollhouse one day for children in need. I've had that, okay? So there's a whole slew of other things going on too. Even some prevalent career choices of individuals with hoarding disorder, the top three: teachers, attorneys, and even social workers. Yikes, I'm in trouble. Yeah, are the top three. And the most hoarded items are papers, clothing, and gifts, right? Because there's always a possibility of, well, I know someone who'd really enjoy this, right? Or my granddaughter would really love this too. But then if you're consistently acquiring new items and your home is already hoarded and you're placing it in, say, a really huge pile of clutter, and you might forget about it. So there's still that consistent accumulation of new gifts, new possibilities, things to treasure, things to share with others. People with hoarding disorder typically will save things of mixed importance, right? Because there is such a difficulty in parting with or discarding items, right? And I would get to that in just a moment, but they typically will start to organize or save things spatially, right? So I'm going to place this here, and I'll get to it later, right? Because that's a bill, right? And then I have something else, and I'm going to put it here. It might be my birth certificate. I don't know. Then I have a receipt. Then I don't want to throw away with. I might need it. I'm going to put it here too. And then imagine if you keep placing papers on top of your table, right, and never actually placing it in its rightful spot, right? Because typically people, when they have their birth certificate, social security card, things of that nature, you might put it in a really special place. I typically, when I go into clients' homes, it's just in a box over in a corner, and it's also mixed with gum wrappers, things of that nature. So there's mixed importance. It sounds like an addiction, right? And I know that shopping is seemed to be part of an addiction, but excessive acquisition is also part of hoarding disorder. I wasn't really going to cover that today because you also see excessive acquisition in animal hoarding too. So there's two other components. Not everyone with hoarding disorder suffers from excessive acquisition, but roughly 85% do. So there's the impulse to buy something, right, because of many reasons, aesthetic beauty, maybe to self-soothe. It might fill the void that you're talking about, right? And then it might lose its value right afterwards until maybe when you get home and you look at it again. So this is a part of hoarding disorder, but the way that you describe it does sound like an addiction, but it's still part of that, you know, the compulsions and obsessing about it too. It's the impulsivity, which is also prevalent in substance abuse as well. It's like the lines are a bit blurred, but hey, I didn't create the rules, right? It's just considered a part of the OCD-related spectrum, okay? Any other questions? Okay, so I talked about prevalent careers, and I talked about things, the three most hoarded items, and I wanted to ask you about papers too. Why do you think that that is the number one hoarded item? You can collect more of them, so think of mail, right? You get mail every day. And especially as you age, you start to get more and more mail. And how do I make a decision about everything? I need to open it. That takes time. I need to open it. I need to read it. There might be something important in there. And in the envelope, there might be 3 pages altogether. I don't even want to deal with it anymore. I'm going to place it on my table, and I'll get to it later. And that later might not come. Okay, so that's just another way of acquiring things, but it's not intentional, right? You have mail, what do you do about it? You just have to make a decision. All right, so why hoarding? I talk about the prevalency. So hoarding affects about 3 to 5% of the US population alone. And so that's roughly over 15 million people in the US. And no, this is not just an American issue, okay? This is around the world, even in Greece, but in the US alone, that's a significant number, actually. And so this study was actually through Johns Hopkins, and it's pretty consistent through the research about the percentage. However, researchers believe that this is a lower figure, and it's actually suspected to be much higher because this particular study was a door-to-door study. So how many people do you think that if you knock on the door, hey, oh, let me see if I can peek in there too, do you have a hoarding problem? Not everyone's going to be so forthcoming that A, someone's coming to my door and I'm going to tell you if I have a problem or not, whatever the problem is. But then to say, oh yes, I do have an issue with hoarding, right? So it's suspected that the figure is much larger. Also, disclaimer here, or side note, please refrain from using the word hoarder, especially as you leave here. So it can be very stigmatizing. People will then associate, like, I am a hoarder as their identity. And again, with that shame, that stigma, it's the same thing as calling someone an addict, right? They're struggling. They might be in recovery, right? They might be relapsing. So just something to think about, okay? Fourth slide, I give you a brief overview of what hoarding is. So it's the persistent difficulty with discarding or parting with items regardless of its actual value. Let me also point out that there's a difference between squalor and hoarding, which is a whole nother category. So people who live in squalor where it's just trash, there's no importance whatsoever. There might be urine, feces, etc. Sorry, you guys just ate. But then if someone says, hey, you need to clean up everything, and they say, sure, whatever, that's not hoarding. That might be something else, okay? That might be substance abuse, it might be depression, it might be some other mental health issue, okay? But when there's the persistent, I can't get rid of it because there is value there regardless of whether or not you and I see it, that would be hoarding, okay? And so in terms of hiding it or not, that could be another sort of whole nother layer, no pun intended, of, well, I think I'm being clever, I think I'm hiding it, or maybe I don't really care, okay? So not everyone is like, I need to hide it, the majority of them do. Typically we'll explain why they're keeping it, okay? So I'm keeping the gum wrapper or whatever we might think is trash because again, high creativity levels. I can use it, I can do something with it, okay? Our reasons for keeping things are very similar too, right? We might keep things for sentimental value, for instrumental value, what if, you never know. Intrinsic value, so it's beautiful, it's aesthetically pleasing, even security reasons, right? Flashlights, batteries, things of that nature. So the similarities in all of us wanting to keep things are very similar with us and even people with hoarding issues. The difference is the attachment level. Okay, so that's the first point. I look for the attachment. Secondly, I look for the result in the accumulation of possessions, which then congest and clutter active living areas, sometimes even causing safety hazard. So for example, blocked egresses, means of exit, obstructed pathways, right? Or even if there are pathways or not, right? Because you might have trip hazards, avalanche risk, things of that nature, okay? Lastly, it causes clinical and significant distress for the individual, impairments in social and occupational functioning or other important areas of functioning. Okay, so we got to look for those three categories, typically, to receive the diagnosis, okay? So cleanouts, like I was mentioning earlier, have the highest chance of recidivism, 99%. Because if you're just removing all of the things, does that solve the issue? If someone has a drinking issue and then you removed all of the alcohol, like prohibition, is that successful? No, they'll just go and buy more alcohol, right? It's the same sort of concept with hoarding, okay? Even though there's years and years and years of accumulated items, right? Memories, things of that nature, there's still the, well, I need to perhaps fill the void, right? I need to acquire new things. You never know. And so then how do you be there for people that are hurting when we focus on the dysfunction of the person instead of just being there for them? I have many, many people who call me, I'm desperate, I need help. I don't want to live like this anymore. It's cost me relationships with my friends, with my family, with people I care about. I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed. I don't want to live like this anymore, but I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to move forward. And that's typically when I get a call. But I get a call from other people referring them too, right? Housing authorities, Board of Health, because there's safety and sanitary issues too. They're going to condemn a home or they're going to evict someone, and I step in, and that's a completely different approach. I'm then in crisis mode, which isn't treatment. We believe that people, again, with the capacity, have the right to make their own choices, right? Self-determination, even if that's really hard and you know these are poor choices, right? They're putting themselves at risk, right? But again, you have to let people do what they want to do, right? And the most important thing you can do is to be empathetic, right? To help and to hear them, right? And to show that love and support and that unconditional love. I always focus on safety first, regardless if someone wants to engage in longer-term clinical treatment meeting every week, or it's crisis, they're facing eviction or condemnation. I always focus on safety first, and I follow a very specific assessment tool that my program has developed, focusing on the safety, again, egresses, pathways, the list kind of goes on, because it provides an objective stance of where we should focus instead of sort of the messages they've received in the past. Well, you need to clean this up, it's a mess. Where do I start? So I use it as a conversation piece. Well, maybe we can start by focusing on ensuring that your front door can open a full 90-degree angle, right? And I use a lot of examples because, again, there's that high creativity piece there too. So we need to make sure that there's at least one window in every room clear. Well, why? I have that door open. Think fire. If there's a fire over here and it's blocking that door, that only exit in that room, and then the window's blocked because of all the stuff, then what do? Right? Oh yes, fire. I need to make sure that that's clear. And that's also based off of housing code too. There's a very specific guideline as to what inspectors are looking for too, or what Board of Health sanitarians are looking for. And then if it's a crisis situation, then we develop a very specific plan with very specific goals and try to meet those goals, and it's more short term. If an individual then wants to engage with me after that, that's another conversation piece. Sometimes people will have that image in mind that, oh, it's all just trash and it looks like what's on Hoarders, the show, right? Think, again, it's a reality show. What makes good reality TV? The most extreme cases. There was actually a case in Gloucester not too long ago where the police department and Board of Health actually wrote to the show Hoarders, and they came and assessed the home. They said it's not extreme enough. We can't film here. So they look for, again, that attention piece. It has to be the worst case scenario because that makes good TV. Okay, but yes, I go into homes that things are very organized, but against that attachment piece, right? I can't let go of it even though everything's in Tupperwares and it's lined up until the ceiling, right? Or it just might look like more like a bomb went off in this room and there's stuff everywhere. So I see varying levels. So why should we as Orthodox Christians care about this? As a disclaimer, I'm not a theologian by any means, all right? I've never studied theology, just attend church. But this is just kind of my opinion, I guess you can say. So firstly, I think that currently we live in such a climate where personal biases and information, misinformation tend to pollute our minds, right? And pollute the way that we form judgments and beliefs about the world around us. However, Orthodox Christianity is not a religion of irrationality, meaning that as Orthodox Christians, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves and to call our personal biases into check, whether they're implicit or explicit. Second, in virtue of calling those biases into check, we are performing an act that seems central to Orthodox Christianity. That is, we are recognizing, again, the inherent dignity and worth of the person, which is a core value of social work, actually. And those people that we may intentionally or unintentionally be passing judgment on. Finally, I'd like to conclude with a quote from Epistle to St. James, chapter 3, verses 9 through 12, which states, "With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water." As a social worker, the passage here especially resonates with me because it seems to be calling Christians to meet people where they are at, not where we think they ought to be. Meeting someone where they are at, such as a person with hoarding disorder or any other behavioral challenge, may be uncomfortable, though it is a monumentous way of showing someone that we love and care about them. Thank you.
Wow.
I figured it out. I figured it out